Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Mitchell. I am a professor of zoological medicine at Louisiana State University. And today, I'm going to talk about snakes. First, I want to talk about a few really unique things about snakes. Specifically, I'd like to talk a little bit about colubrids, which include things like corn snakes and king snakes. First of all, they're one group of reptiles that are all carnivorous. Another very unique thing about them is that whereas we and most other animals have a fixed mandible, they actually have a flexible jaw, and that's what allows them to eat their prey whole. In captivity, snakes can live for quite an extended period of time. The corn snakes and king snakes we're going to talk about today easily can live into their mid-20s. Never get a snake that you're not prepared to be able to house it long term, especially with how long they can live. First, I'd like to actually talk about the enclosure, because that's really where everything starts. Snakes have been bred in captivity for decades. The reason we have so many different types of morphs of things like king snakes, corn snakes, and pythons is because people breed them. And they can breed them and house them in very small containers because of the sheer numbers of animals they need for breeding. I prefer, for my pet snakes or recommendations to client snakes, to get the biggest enclosure you can. For a juvenile snake, something as small as a 20-gallon long tank, which is at least 24 inches, would be sufficient, but they're going to quickly outgrow those. My preference is to get a larger tank to begin with, such as this 40-gallon breeder. When we're housing our snakes, it's important that we house them separately because it's not uncommon for some species of snakes to cannibalize one another. And of course with snakes, because moms don't like snakes in the house either, is to have a secure screen on. Snakes are really quite adept at sliding and moving screens, so it should be locked down so that that snake can't get out. The next thing I want to talk about is substrate. And substrate is really important for these animals. When I'm dealing with a juvenile animal or a recently acquired animal, I'll often use something like a reptile bed liner or newspaper so that I could actually have the client monitor or collect feces so we can check it for parasites. My preference for any reptile is to use something that is aesthetically pleasing as well as is functional. The orchid bark that you can see that we've put in this enclosure, for example, works well for that. By putting 2 to 3 inches of substrate into the enclosure, for those snakes that want to burrow, it gives them an area to kind of go and hide, which is a natural behavior for them. It's really important to spot clean any fecal or urine waste that you see in the enclosure, and I typically replace the bedding every 1 to 2 months. Always disinfect the entire enclosure when you're doing that. The next thing I want to talk about are accessories or cage furniture. The first thing with our snakes is to provide them a very wide, shallow water bowl. It's important that this is large enough for the snake to get into because these animals will use this water bowl not only for drinking but for soaking. In addition to that large water bowl, you can go ahead and make sure that you get other types of accessories such as large branches for climbing and areas for shelter. Don't hesitate to put in a number of branches, and you can put the branches in an area to allow the animal to get closer to the heat sources we're going to talk about so that they can bask as they desire. And it really is important to have multiple shelters within an enclosure. The shelters are a place that these animals who like to burrow will go and hide so that they can kind of get out of sight, because that's a natural thing for them. I like to make sure that I have these types of caves on both sides of the enclosure, the heated side and the cooler side, so that the snake is not trying to always hide and risking losing some of that valuable temperature or being at too high of a temperature when they don't really want to be. Next, I'd like to talk about temperature and lighting for your captive snake. This is really important for these animals because they're ectotherms, and unlike us, they require environmental temperature to regulate their core temperature. These animals need to be able to move in and out of heat to be able to do that. And of course, we can create that for them in their environment. There are 3 different types of light that we try to work with in captivity for our reptiles. And these 3 types of light mimic the natural light that's produced by the sun: UV light, visible light, and infrared light. The first I'd like to talk about is the infrared light, and this talks about the spectrum of light where heat comes from. I prefer to keep a warm basking area in an enclosure about 85 to 88 degrees. And I like a cool side to be around 82 down to about 78 degrees during the day. That way the snake can move as it needs to regulate that temperature. There are different types of incandescent lights that can be used to do that. And the type of bulb and the wattage is going to be based on the size of your enclosure. Always read the label on the box because it will give you some guidance for how much heat the bulb will provide based on the distance. Of course, if you want to generate a little bit more heat at night because of where you're at, you're concerned about the temperature, there are red lamps that can do that without really affecting the eyesight or vision of the snake. In cases where you live where it may be a little bit too cool or your ambient temperature is really cool and you're worried about the lighting, we can also use undertake heating sources, and these adhere right to the bottom of the enclosure. And we can put one of their shelters nearby to allow them to generate some of that temperature. At nighttime, all of our captive reptiles need to experience a drop in temperature. Room temperature in the low 70s or high 60s is absolutely perfect for these animals, and they'll do just fine. My preference is only to give them 12 to 14 hours of photo period. That type of light duration mimics the sun. It doesn't give them too much light. Now, I also mentioned visible light and UVB light, and for a long time people didn't think that UVB light was essential to things like corn snakes and king snakes. But research in my lab has shown that these animals significantly increase their vitamin D when they're exposed to these types of lights. So I do recommend 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour at night for corn snakes and king snakes to be exposed to this light. It's also a really high quality visible light. Once you've got all of your lighting set up for these animals, it's really important to think about that temperature. And in those cases, we want to have a thermometer, hygrometer to help measure that. We have all kinds of different types of hygrometers, thermometers that can be used, from very simple units to my preference, the digital units. The digital unit set up in this enclosure right here can be moved around, so we can check the warm area and we can check the cooler area to ensure it's meeting that temperature gradient we talked about. And in addition to temperature, humidity becomes very important for snakes, and there's different ways we can provide that. Sometimes simply moistening an orchid bark like this will help to increase the humidity, or we can create small humidity chambers by adding sphagnum moss that's wetted down and inside the little cavity to make a burrow. Having a hygrometer that can measure that humidity becomes very important in those cases. And for corn snakes and king snakes, my preference is that their humidity is between about 60 and 80%. Snakes are carnivores. And so for those of you who might not be as interested in feeding something like a rodent to their pet snake, there are other reptiles that might better suit you. For those who say, well, I'm just a little squeamish about feeding a live animal, I'm with you. I don't really think that that's necessary to do in captivity. And in addition, as a veterinarian, I've seen what can happen in those results if the snake doesn't eat the rodent. I've had to euthanize several snakes that were injured as a result of a rat or a mouse chewing on the snake. Fortunately, there are people that sell frozen mice that you can thaw and feed. They come in different sizes in the mouse as well as in the rat world, and of course you should offer the appropriate size food, which is usually going to be about 1 to 1.5 times the size of its head. My recommendation is that a snake should be fed as often as it defecates, and for a corn snake or a king snake, it's about once a week for an adult snake, whereas a juvenile snake can be fed anywhere from every 2 to 4 days. I'd like to talk a little bit about the behavior of snakes and handling them so that we can do it safely. When we're handling these animals, if we watch what they're doing as we pick them up, it'll help minimize any potential injuries such as bites. Another thing to consider is after you've recently fed a snake is to minimize handling for at least 2 to 3 days. You want these animals to have a little bit of time to get started on digestion, because if you start to overhandle them, sometimes they'll regurgitate or vomit, and that can have a negative effect on them. If you ever notice anything that seems to be out of the ordinary with your snake, it's important to go ahead and contact a veterinarian with experience with these animals. Examples might include more time hiding, a weakness or a lethargy, they don't seem interested in eating, you're noticing weight loss, chronic shedding problems, discharge from the eyes, nose, or mouth, a labored breathing, or abnormal feces such as a diarrhea, be reasons again that you may want to go ahead and contact your veterinarian. Since we've got our enclosure all set up, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our new friend. I'm going to gently grasp his body and then supporting his body, bring him out. Most snakes don't like their head grasped because that's how most predators grab them. So just gently supporting that spine so that the snake knows that it's not going to fall is really important. I'm going to go ahead and get him in his enclosure. And once we get him set up, we're going to go ahead and give him a little bit of time to help minimize any potential issues. If you're interested in more information, to download a snake care sheet or to order any of the products featured in this video, visit flukerfarms.com.